Hi guys, and welcome back. And today we get on with building the display base for the little Spitfire, and then the final reveal with a couple of other bits and pieces towards the end. But first, the intro.
So come upstairs for a quickie.
Darling, I can't.
You can't.
You know I can't.
You mean you don't want to?
Can't.
I want to watch YouTube.
You spend all your time watching that crap. Have you got some sort of thing for that bastard?
For God's sake, Colin, don't start that all over again.
You know I love watching Hallidan.
I knew this would happen. You know I never wanted you to.
Subscribe.
Never.
Colin,
You didn't take a
please.
blind bit of notice.
Try to behave as if I were a human being.
More like a desperate YouTube groupie.
I just can't resist his silky smooth voice and his strong manly hand.
For God's sake, who's asking you to?
My god, what's he got that I haven't got?
Oh, I never could stand watching women. You couldn't care less, could you?
His hands aren't the only bit I want. It's a good 8 inches.
I didn't measure it.
I did. I even booked a room.
Eight inches.
It'd be marvelous.
Are you going to unsubscribe or not?
So I had a couple of people send some photos in of Spitfires they'd done, and not necessarily as part of the build-along, but I'm happy to share them anyway because I think they're pretty cool. And the first two are of a Spitfire that AK's done, and I like the propeller, which he says he made out of the clear plastic of a Chinese takeaway food container, and I think that's pretty cool. It looks good. And the second pair of photos is from Ian, and this is a Luke Skywalker Spitfire, and that's, I think, a really clever build and painting, and particularly love the little R2-D2 that's sitting up in the back there, and a nice little piece of kit bashing to come up with that. So both really nice, and really pleased that both of you guys sent them through, so thank you very much. So as I was building the Spitfire, I decided I wanted to have it on a display base and it needed some height. And this is my planned drawing. It's about as good as it gets as far as my design work goes. Fundamentally driven by how many could I fit on one shelf, and that dictated the size, which conveniently also accommodated the 1/72nd scale footprint of the plane. So those measurements let me theoretically build 8 of these display stands to have 8 planes on display on the shelf. In looking at it now, I think I might go back to 7 just so it's not quite as tight and cluttered, but we'll see how that goes. And the reality is, those of you who have been watching for a while know I'm not going to bash 7 planes out in a real hurry anyway, so I've got plenty of time to work my way through it. But there's my design, and attention to detail is more about the millimetres, so I know what I can fit in, and we'll have a look at the rest of it unfold now. So the display base itself is mainly balsa sheet, and the main body of the box is 5mm thick by 75mm high, and that was just me eyeballing the sheet saying, yeah, I think that looks around about the right height. So I quite like working with balsa because it's very easy to handle. You're not generally dealing with great big long sheets, so I can fit it on my desk. It is very easy to mark up, quite pale, so your pencil lines always show up. And it is also incredibly easy to cut, and you can typically do that with a sharp X-Acto blade. Now, when you're building things like this at a small scale, it's important to be really, really careful with your measurements, because if something's 105mm long and you're out by 1 or 2 millimeters, it's really going to look bad. It's really going to look pronounced. Whereas if you're building a set of bookshelves in your spare bedroom, and the wall's 3 meters long and you're out by 1 mil, it's almost going to be unnoticeable. So the reduction in scale emphasizes any errors, so really, really careful with measuring. And it's a classic measure twice, cut once. I measure about 4 times and then cut nervously, and try and be very precise in the cutting so you get nice flush ends. Now, the downside of using balsa wood, of course, is that it cuts beautifully with the grain, but across the grain, it's a little bit harder. And just using an X-Acto can sometimes leave it a bit bruised and dinted. So I scored here just to start, and I found my tiny little hobby miter saw, which eventually I got going in a smooth and fluid motion. And the difference that made for the cut, you didn't have any of the compressed fibres that just carving through it with the X-Acto blade caused. And look, I probably said this a few times through the painting video, but the secret is just to take your time. If you try and rush things like this, you don't get as good a result, but that's a nice, beautiful, smooth cut, and none of the fibres have been damaged. The downside of balsa wood is that it is very, very soft, so it's so easy to put a dent in it or take a piece out of it. And I've done that a couple of times. You'll see as things unfold, but don't think that outweighs the ease and the convenience of being able to build stuff with it. So time to stick all this together and with the white glue, and finally finding a use for those useless paintbrushes that I bought for about $3. Just painting on the white glue. Being careful not to put too much. I don't want it squeezing out. So keeping it pretty thin, and then using a square to make sure it's all honky-dory. You wouldn't often hear the word honky-dory on a YouTube video. And then once I've got it right, one of the joys of using the balsa wood is you can pin it together, and that really helps it keep its shape, and it glues nice and square, or it glues in the position you want it to be in. And all I'm doing here now is just adding some additional glue to the inside corners, just painting that on again reasonably thinly, although not as thin as I did on the earlier attempt. And it's just to give it some additional strength, and there'll be some other stuff that we do further on to give it more strength so it's quite robust. And that gives us our basic box. And then all we're really doing from this point onwards is a little bit of decorative edging, and then figuring out the best way of displaying the little Spitfire on the top of the box. So this is all pretty straightforward now. I just wanted to do the edge along the bottom of the box. So cutting up some more balsa and just getting it into the rough size. And I thought it might look all a bit too square if I just went with the square strips of balsa, so I got some round 3mm balsa just to break up that sort of angular visage of the display stand. And as usual, I'm using the plastic signboard for the base. This is that corrugated, I think it's Corflute. This brand is Quill, but they're all the same, and very easy to work with and very light. And pretty happy with myself here, because this would be the snuggest fit that I've achieved through this method of putting the base together, so big pat on the back for myself. And now just using the little Proxxon chop saw to get the 45-degree angles to help me form the frame. I love using that Proxxon because it gives really clean, sharp angles even through the balsa. So now just a matter of gluing and pinning. The white glue is also pretty forgiving to work with as well, so any overspill and a slightly moistened Q-tip will take care of that, and you'll notice I just put a little bit of tape to help hold the corners together while it was drying. Now I have a confession to make here. I thought filling this gap with the white glue it would dry and effectively become my gap filler, but it dried and disappeared. So it was right about this point in the construction that I decided that I wouldn't mind illuminating this, and so I changed my thinking in terms of what the top of the display base would look like, and that brought perspex into the equation. And I had one of those little puck lights that I thought would work well, and did a little bit of testing, and it seemed to illuminate quite nicely. So all of this should have been done in pre-construction phase, but I didn't think of it until after construction, so I'm just creating a doorway here, so I'll be able to get the puck in and out in the future to change the batteries should they run down, which is almost certainly going to happen. So I was looking for a nice tight fit, so we didn't have a lot of light bleed, and that wasn't a great piece, so I ended up cutting a replacement piece for the door that fitted more snugly. And this next little bit is just me building a frame for the access door to fit snugly into, and employing a nemoidium magnet, I think that's the right term, or a rare earth magnet. And I don't know if you guys get it in other countries, but we often get advertising that you can stick onto your fridge, and I tend to keep those. I don't know why, I always have, but they sometimes come in useful, and I chopped up a bit of that fridge magnet to be on the back of the little door, so it would connect to the magnet, and it all worked rather well. And here I'm just carving out a little receptacle nook to take the nemoidium battery. And then using my new favourite glue, the 5-minute fix, which is UV cured and is a very tough bond once it is cured. Just creating the recess here for my little piece of fridge magnet. And the fridge magnet material is really quite soft, so I'm able to pin that and then use my UV glue to set it in place. And really happy with the way it holds. I mean, it will never be subject to shaking like this, but it holds fast regardless. And I've just got a little knob here, which I'll use for the handle, so I can easily open the access door. Undercoating here with Vallejo black primer. So then I hit it with some gloss clear coat, and that was really just to give a little bit of strength and protection to the undercoat, because the balsa wood is very absorbent, and I thought this might help the top coats not just disappear back into the woodwork. So my original plan was to use some automotive paint, and this is iron grey, because I thought I wanted to have a look of metallic and a sheen to it, and you can actually polish this stuff up. But I wasn't overly happy with how it turned out. So I'm just getting the inner dimensions because I want a piece of perspex to sit on the inside within the frame. And then marking that up on its 3mm clear perspex. And this stuff comes and it's got a protective coating on either side, and that's really important to keep on for as long as humanly possible, as I found to my detriment when I took it off a bit too early, and one of the pieces just sitting on my bench and having moved it a couple of times, not having any violent contact with anything at all, but managed to scratch up the top of it pretty badly actually, so I had to cut a replacement piece for the very top part that's on final display. So outside on the workbench, and I'm using my jigsaw with what I believed was a special perspex cutting blade or an acrylic cutting blade. Because my recollection was the last time I'd cut acrylic it was with this thing, because I was cutting a circle for a router sort of like guide. But I got the strong sense as I was working my way through this that it wasn't a special blade to cut through acrylic, because it was a bit of a labour. And long story short, not overly happy with the smoothness of the edge, and subsequently I did a lot of work on sanding and the like, but never really 100%, because the nature of these blades is they will tend to blend. I mean, mine's just a crappy jigsaw, it's not a very expensive one, and I think it's probably 20 years old, so there's probably much better stuff in the market that can do a better job. As it turns out, I ended up just using the drop saw with a normal blade, but I could keep everything square and straight. So again, the top plate that you see in the final product is got one little blemish in the corner, just out of my control really. It just happened. I can't explain why. But yeah, much cleaner than what this result ended up being. And so here I am carefully cutting out the photo montage, if you like, which is going to sit on top of the first sheet of acrylic and underneath the slightly larger second sheet. And I'm really happy about these pictures, actually. So I went trawling. Well, I actually started thinking about why did EFX make that particular plane and use that particular box art? Because initially I couldn't find anything significant about that plane. And the further I looked into it, aside from the fact that they were a squadron, the 92nd Squadron, that was heavily involved in the original fighting Battle of Britain. So that's probably the reason that squadron was chosen. Why that plane? And I couldn't find a reason anywhere, but I eventually went down an internet rabbit hole of just following link after link after link, and sadly I've actually got no idea where I landed this, but I think it was like a reunion former members blog page, which hadn't probably been updated for many years, and there were some photos in there from the 92nd Squadron. And joy of joy, aside from the group photo of the boys, there was a photo of a plane taken from another plane, which is the one in the top right-hand corner. But the thing I was delighted about was the photo on the bottom of the 3 Spitfires. The one in the middle is actually that registration. It is the same plane, and I was chuffed to find that. So we'll have a better look at them in close-up a little bit further along. But yeah, really, really pleased that I was able to find relevant pictures to the actual kit and the box art on the kit. And again, in this instance, using a 2mm balsa to make a little frame for the inside piece of acrylic to sit on, just measuring the depth there with a cut-off piece of acrylic to make sure I've got it in the right position. And glue and pin as always. So this was another idea as the construction went along, and I thought, if I'm backlighting the top part underneath the photo, why don't I use that same backlighting to illuminate the squadron emblem in the front? So just measuring up to find the centre, and you can follow this along pretty simply, drilling a hole and carving it out and getting it ready for the final painting. So I retrieved one of the test prints that I'd done from the bin and cut that out so it's exactly the same size as the gloss photo version of the emblem, and just pinned that on so I could get the size and shape that I needed to carve out. And then just using the point of the X-Acto, I didn't try and cut all the way through the balsa, I just wanted to effectively create an outline of the emblem so that once I took the paper off, I'd have a very clear path to follow to cut it out. Now, the reality is this was unplanned. In the next build of one of these I'll cut all these holes out before I glue any of the frame together, and it'll be a lot easier to do that on the little bandsaw than it is trying to do it after it's constructed. So that worked pretty well. You can see the outline quite clearly there, and it's easy even for my dodgy old eyes to follow. And then really just a combination of the X-Acto to, again, slow it. It's easy to cut through this stuff with the grain, but against the grain you have to be careful that you don't bruise it and just push it out of the way rather than cut through it. So like everything I always say, you've just got to take your time and work through it quietly and calmly, and you usually get a pretty good result. To get into some of the more difficult things, I introduced a little saw blade that you can attach to your X-Acto, and that moved things along pretty well. Now gluing the acrylic, the bottom layer of acrylic onto the little frame we created earlier, using the 5-second fix, the UV cured glue, and just putting a little bit of that in each corner. I've been paranoid throughout this build about the effect any glue might have on the acrylic in terms of clouding it or staining it or causing me to sand something. So this was a good little test because you won't be able to see this anyway once it's cured. And the joy of the UV glue under the acrylic is the ultraviolet light gets through the acrylic to glue it underneath, which if it was a solid object wouldn't work. So that's quite good. Only 4 little dots, and that's quite solid. Very happy with that. And now just making a little frame for the emblem that's going on the front. Same formula as always, some white glue, and I've already cut the acrylic that will sit over the hole that we made. So wanting this to be really snug and pushing it very close against the edges. And then pinning just to make sure it doesn't go wandering off. Now, I was never really happy with just the automotive dark iron colour that I sprayed on. So then I mottled it a little bit with some flat black, and it was a bit loopy, as you can see. I sort of showed that before. So I'm going in with a little bit of grey now, and what started to emerge in my thinking was to try and replicate the marble type effect that's on the emblem, and it's also what I used around the edge of the photo on the top. Now, that hasn't necessarily been brilliantly successful, but when I look at it now, and it's been sitting on the shelf for a few days now, it actually looks pretty good, so I'm quite happy with it, but it just took a bit of time to get used to. And the technique here is I've got the PSI really low, it's under 10, so hardly anything's coming out when I pull the trigger, but when I release the trigger, a little splurt comes out, and that got a pretty nice effect, I think. And now cutting off just a very small strip of plastic card, and that is just to finish up around the inside edge of the frame to stop any light bleed, and also just make it look a little bit nicer, a little bit more like a monument might look, I think. And just to put a little bit of a splash of colouring, because it's all black and grey by and large, I thought I'd go with that inside edge of the frame as being a metallic gold. And if you haven't figured it out already, I'm deeply in love with this 5-minute fix, and I used it to secure the plastic to the balsa wood, a really tight edge inside around the frame, and that was that part done. So to finish the whole emblem part off, very carefully removing the protective sheeting from the acrylic. I'm paranoid about this, because you desperately don't want to get any scratches, and I didn't want to get any thumbprints or fingerprints. A little bit of the adhesive spray on the back of the actual picture of the emblem, and just pushing that down firmly, making sure there's no dust or crinkly bits or anything like that. The frame just slips over it, and it's snug as it clicks into place. Again, really happy about that, so no glue required. Just smoothing it all down, making sure it's fitting snugly and there's no bits of dust or anything like that on it. And extremely happy with the finished product. Time now to give it a matte varnish before I put any of the pictures anywhere near it, so I don't want the matte surface affecting the gloss of the pictures. So I did a test fitting with the light on and found there was still a little bit of bleed through the edges, so I just painted the black rim around that, but careful not to getting the paint behind the actual emblem itself. And that clips in there beautifully, nice and firm, and no glue required, and very pleased with that. I think it looks quite good. I've glued the little knob onto the back door again. Guess what? The 5-second fix, and that is nice and firm. Got my little bit of fridge magnet ready to rock and roll. That'll click up to my medium magnet. Now this is the recut piece of balsa for the back door, and that's a pretty firm fit as well. So we're in the home straight. Get the protective tape off and start working on getting the photo mounted. So just making sure the surface of this is as dust free and clean as possible, so using some just spectacle glass cleansers. It's got a little bit of alcohol in them, so it dries up streak free, and then just trying to blow any microscopic particles of dust off with the airbrush. And now just preparing the back of the photo. Same sort of thing, wiping it down with the glasses wipe to get any stickiness or fingerprints or oils off, and then blowing any dust away with the airbrush. So having used the photo adhesive spray on the back, just carefully positioning it on top of the acrylic. Just making sure it's in exactly the right spot, that it's taking up in all the corners. Making sure it's more particularly flush with the front, because that's what you'll see. And then again, just gently polishing, trying to make sure there's no air bubbles underneath and it's perfectly smooth, but doing it carefully so I don't actually move it out of position. And that's what it looks like when it's done. Again, quite happy with that. So as you can see, the edge where it's been cut is showing through the white photo paper, and that's obviously not very good. So my initial plan for resolving that was to gently mask the top of the photo so that I could then go in with the black paint and just take that whiteness out of it all. However, when I took the tape off, that's what happened. So very unhappy about that. So look, not a massive disaster. Reprinted the picture, cut it out again, but this time before I glued it down, I went through with my black paint and very carefully just dragged it along the edge, wiping anything that hit the top. It was actually pretty easy to do and never really needed to be taped, so lesson learnt there. It's come out okay. So on to almost the last step and the most stressful one, which was getting the acrylic on the top. So I was paranoid about glue, I was paranoid about oil, fingerprints, dust. I was very paranoid. So I tried to handle it very carefully in preparation, in getting the tape off, put some clean serviettes down for it to rest on, so I didn't pick up any scratches from the cutting mat, because that's got some hard bits and pieces that have bits of glue and clay and what have you on there. And then thought about, how am I going to do this? I didn't want any glue going anywhere near it. But I didn't want it to be loose because I didn't want it to get knocked and it get damaged, and even worse, the Spitfire get damaged as well. And so I had been pondering this for some time, and my solution is to pin it in place, similar to how I pin the balsa wood together when it's gluing, but some slightly more decorative pins, and I think that will work okay. So just cleaning things up a little bit here, again, just getting rid of any of the obvious marks on the surface, and then positioning it so I can make sure it's got the correct overlap on all sides. So these are the pins, which I may or may not have appropriated from my wife's jewellery making supplies, and then just making a little dot with a felt tipped pen on the corner of the balsa wood. And now for the really stressful part, which is drilling the holes through the acrylic. So to start off with, I just used my pointy metal thing to give the drill a starting point, and I'd put a blue tack to spirit level onto the top of the Dremel because I didn't want it going in on an angle. I'd done a dozen or so test drills on a bit of offcut, and they all went in on an angle. And then when I glued the spirit level to the top of it, that fixed that problem, so that was good to do those practices beforehand. So once I finished drilling through the acrylic, I just put it back on top and then checked the measurements to make sure the overhang was still all correct. And at the very last hurdle, and man, I was super stressed by this stage because the last thing to do was to push the pins through the acrylic into the balsa wood, and I was terrified that I was going to have a rupture, that I was going to push them out through the side. Had I drilled the holes into the balsa wood straight? Did I have any little burrs on the bottom of the pins since I had to cut them? And this was sort of like, don't cock it up now when you've got 4 pins to put in and be done with it. So managed to get through it without any drama. And that's it. Big sigh of relief. I didn't actually bugger anything up, just giving it a nice little polish now to make sure my dirty fingerprints are off it and it's looking nice and clean. And generally, I'd have to say I am pretty happy with how this turned out. A little bit fiddly. Design changed on the fly as it was being built, so that didn't help. That made it more complex than it needed to be. But otherwise, fundamentally, anyone can do this. I mean, it's balsa wood. The acrylic I just bought online, 2 3mm sheets, was about $7 for the 2 of them delivered, and a bit of glue, and that's about it. So not overly complex. You don't need to buy the automotive paint, and I wouldn't do it again because it didn't really work out the way I had thought. Anyway, a few pictures now, and then I'll come back and say so long. So throughout the build, I just used a plain white puck-like, but I ordered online some new ones with the remote control, so I don't have to keep going through the back door to turn them on and off. And these are also multicoloured, so we've got the white, the red, the blue, and the green. So I think I can run up to 8 lights off this, so that should cover all of the planes when they eventually get done, somewhere in about 2045, I guess. So thanks for watching. Like and share. Subscribe and don't forget to click on the bell to get notifications. And as always, guys, really looking forward to your comments. So that's it for this one. I will have hot on the heels of this the final reveal of the Spitfire. And then the video after that will be the unboxing of the next project. So take care, everyone. Look after yourselves. Stay healthy. And I will catch you in the next one. Bye.